الرحمن الرحيم وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. نوينا التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله والسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على الخير ابتغاء مرضات الله ووجهه وقربه وثوابه. اللهم افتح علينا واستر علينا برحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام. يا عليم علمنا من علمك ما ترضى به عنا ولا تؤاخذنا بما تعلمه منا. يا وحققنا بحقائق العلم. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. I'm extremely happy and honored to be here with you in this great university and in this wonderful country, and to have your attention. My natural inclination is to try to speak as shortly as possible and to open up the floor so that you can speak and you can express your opinions, and hopefully we can have a dialogue. I think that's the most beneficial thing of all, because we need to understand each other, we have to know each other's situations to truly benefit. Spiritual education in the contemporary context. I think one of the things that is very important to begin with is the fact that in the traditional Islamic world and in most cultures and civilizations universally, it was believed that there is a direct and necessary connection between intellect and virtue, between intellect and goodness. Today, in the secular world, we often consider education to be essentially a transmission of ideas or a cultivation of ideas in which the cognitive process of receiving information and being able to give back information is the key goal. And I think this would be one of the first things that we would have to assess and question, and probably you do that anyway, as Muslims in this country concerned with education. So traditionally, education for us was never and could never be just ideas or just information. And the concept of education in the West, traditionally, was also not like that. In fact, the very word educate, to educate, meant to guide people out of something into something else. And probably the metaphor that underlies the word itself is guiding people out of darkness into light, out of confusion into certainty, out of ignorance into knowledge, but a knowledge that is transformative. So for us in our tradition, and again this is not unique to us, this is the way that most people were, we believe that virtue, the cultivation of virtue, is absolutely central to the cultivation of intellect and to education itself. And in Arabic, the whole concept of intellect, al-aql, is one that is essentially ethical. Intellect is that capacity to perceive first principles, to distinguish truth from falsehood, to be able to understand experience and to study it. But intellect is also that ethical quality that we have that makes us be virtuous, because we know what is good and we must do it, and we must bind ourselves to do it. And we know what is evil and wrong, and we must, by intellect, keep ourselves from doing it. So I think this is very important, that goodness must be an essential part of education in general. To speak of spiritual education without speaking of virtue and goodness would be absurd. But in our view, the cultivation of all types of education required virtue. And an example that I can give of that, which I love very much, and if you've listened to me talk, you've heard me say this a dozen times, is a great work on chemistry that was written by one of the greatest minds in chemistry ever, who is Jabir ibn al-Hayyan. And he lived in the 2nd century of the Islamic era, which is the 8th century, the 700s of the Common Era. And he wrote over 100 works in chemistry, not in alchemy, but in chemistry. And in one of his books, which is called Kitabu Sab'in, the book of 70, I don't know why he called it that way. It does have 70 chapters. Some people say it's because it has 70 chapters. But also, why does it have 70 chapters? But he begins with effuse praise of God. Beautiful praise of God. And then he talks about purification of the self. And then he makes statements to the effect that if you, the student or the reader, cannot join in that praise and do not understand the importance of purification of the soul, then there's no reason for you to study chemistry. That you're not for it, and it's not for you. That's, of course, a very different worldview from that of the secular world and the secular sciences that we know today. And that's because of the fact that in our tradition, everything was spiritual. There was no compartmentalized spirituality that took us out of the realm of physics or chemistry or embryology or mathematics to some airy domain that is spiritual, quote unquote. But also it's because Jabir ibn Hayyan, who's one of the greatest minds in human history and in Islamic history, he understood that virtue is essential to knowledge, if that knowledge is going to be worthy of that name, whether it's chemistry or whatever it might be. And there are also other realities, because Jabir believed that, as all Muslim scientists believed, by the way, that the basic purpose why we study science is what? Self-knowledge. That's also radically different from the world view today. And we know that Francis Bacon, when he talks about the new science and he takes the new directions that he took, his concept of science was that it would be the means to power and to wealth and to the domination of the nation state over other nation states and ultimately over colonies. But our view is very different. We believe that the human being is the microcosm, is al-insanu saghir, the little human being. And we believe that the world around us, the stars, the planets, and everything else, was al-insanu kabir, the big human being, the macrocosm. And this is again not a view that is unique to us. It's a view that most traditional peoples held, even the First Nations of my country and of Canada. But this is very important because it also meant that I am the blueprint of the world, and the world is the blueprint of me. And therefore, when I study the world, I am studying myself also. This is extremely rich. And again, if we were to talk about modern thought and modern science and modern education, we would see how radically different the 2 points of view are. Because one of the characteristics of modern science is the fact that it is based on a radical dualism that we call Cartesian dualism, that goes back to Descartes, in which he creates this bifurcation, this radical division between subject, me, the cognitive being, and between the objects around us, extensions in space, as he called them. And this dualism is extremely problematic because it means that you can never bridge the gap. You can never get out of yourself for sure. One of the things I like to say, and I'm not the one who made it up, someone much more intelligent and much more gifted than myself, Wolfgang Smith, is that modern physics doesn't believe in red apples. He's a physicist, by the way, and he's a mathematician. He's one of the best. But what does that mean? Modern physics doesn't believe in red apples. It means that because of Cartesian dualism, modern physics does not know the reality of that red apple in itself. And it believes, with a strong degree of probability, not certainty, that there is a molecular structure that exists out there in the world of objects, which is probably two-dimensional, but we make it three. And we perceive it and we make it the three-dimensional red apple. Okay, this is a huge cognitive problem. It's a huge cognitive problem. And it goes through most modern thought. But in our view, there is no gap. I am the blueprint of the world. The world is the blueprint of me. So if I study about water, which to us was sacred, couldn't be polluted, then I'm actually studying about me also. And there is a kinship relationship between us and the world around us. The red apples, which we believe are red apples in the third dimension, and the trees and the birds and the water and the plants. These are very important things, and these are spiritual realities as well, because we do not believe in an inanimate physical world that has no intrinsic value. We don't believe in that. We believe that we have a kinship relationship with the world, and that everything in the world has value. It's created by God. God is beautiful, and He loves beauty, and everything He makes is beautiful, and He does not love ugliness. And so we have a relationship with that world. And therefore, in our traditional civilization, we are always very considerate of the natural world. We always lived in the natural world with great respect and great harmony. And we took care of the environment. This was a fundamental part of our tradition. It was even in our cities. Our cities were garden cities. The traditional, and we liked to have animals in our cities. Of course, that was before cars and before these modern trucks and buses and things. But we believed that having animals in the city and taking good care of them is what makes us human, makes us humane. We had endowments to take care of old animals, so that in cities like Damascus, when you had a donkey or a mule or a horse that got old, you couldn't send it to the glue factory, but you took it to an endowment on the banks of the river, one of the most beautiful rivers in the world, the one that goes through Damascus, which is now so polluted it's black. Now it runs red with human blood. And you had a place where the horses and the mules would live out their last years, grazing the grass and drinking the water, and maybe they can't even stand on their feet. And we showed them great mercy. This is really amazing. We loved animals. We took care of animals. And all of this is spirituality. All of this is the kind of goodness that makes the human being complete. So first of all, spiritual education, but we would say in our tradition, all education. Physics, chemistry, biology, whatever it may be, it's got to be ethical. It's got to have virtue in it. It's got to have goodness in it. And when it does that, then it releases our intellectual capacity. And it makes us also creative. And one of the fundamental principles of our civilization, and again, we have to be very honest and generous, of most traditional civilizations and cultures, was that beauty is the splendor of truth. And inshallah, I'm going to talk about that tomorrow in greater detail, and about some other things as well, such as the roots of Islam in America that our brother referred to. But beauty is the splendor of truth. And what does that mean? It means that in reality, God, that created reality, is good. God is perfectly good. God is beautiful. And He loves beauty. This is what our Prophet taught us, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there is then a universal routing between God, and God is, of course, al-haq, the absolute, the ultimately real, the absolutely real, the truth. He is al-haq. Between God, al-haq, and all His other names, and then between goodness, virtue. And this is because the closer that you get to God, which is the purpose of our spirituality, isn't it? That in our spirituality, we want to know God. We want to be close to God. We want to taste the sweetness of the worship we do. We want to be alive when we read the Quran, and when we pray, and when we fast, and do other acts of worship. So the closer we get to God, then the more real we become. The more that you approach al-haq, who is the absolutely real, the more real you become. The more sane you become. The the more balanced you become, the more you become. But this also means that that beauty, which is the beauty of God, it is stamped on you inwardly. So you become inwardly beautiful. And to be inwardly beautiful means to be virtuous. That's what virtue is. That's what goodness is. They are inward beauty. Beauty of the soul. Getting the soul properly ordered, properly balanced. And we call proper order and balance in Islam justice. Adl. Because adl for us is getting everything in the right place. Getting everything balanced properly. And this is one of the first fruits of virtue. So there is God, the real truth. The truth will set you free. And then there is virtue. And there's no intellect without that. There cannot be in our conception and in our experience. And then we get out of that beauty. And you are very beautiful people. You are one of the most beautiful people on earth. This is the truth. I mean, you're people who have amazing sophistication, amazing taste in the houses that you build, the houses you built, the gardens you make, even your cities. Because when we look at this city, which is a modern secular city, and the modern secular city always struggles with ugliness. And we admit that. London will admit that. Paris will admit that. New York will admit that we struggle with ugliness. But in this secular city, you probably have a component of beauty that few cities can match. Even in your high rises, the way you build them, the architectural structure, the way you do your porches and so forth, usually this is very beautiful. And this means also that you have a connection to truth. Because you don't have beauty. You don't have a taste for beauty if you're not also connected to truth. And how are you connected to truth? Well, what is the universal routing? Through virtue, through goodness, through adab, through courtesy. So this is very, very important. And beauty is at the essence of spirituality. Virtue is at the essence of spirituality. Sound intellect that is based in truth and acknowledgement of it and allegiance to it. This is also spirituality. And you have also the opposite routing, which is that ugliness is the brand of falsehood. So when we see ugliness, which is one of the crises of the modern world, by its own admission, then we know, at least we know in terms of our tradition, that there's got to be a problem with truth. There's got to be a problem with God, belief in God, knowledge of God, which is central to our nature. And there's got to be a problem with virtue. Because the other routing is falsehood, evil, vice, and ugliness. These go together. In our educational system, therefore, we were always very concerned with the cultivation of truth, which is always connected to God, and into the belief in God, and the knowledge of God, with theological and metaphysical sophistication. And then virtue and goodness and beauty. These are all connected together. And this is why also when we talk about spirituality, we talk about spiritual education, There are a lot of other things that we have to attend to. And one of those is the fact of we don't want to compartmentalize. We don't want to consider spirituality as something distinct from everything else of value. Why should spirituality be distinct from chemistry, or physics, or mathematics, or geometry? And in our tradition it never was. Because again, we had brilliant mathematics, brilliant geometry, but it was also sacred. That we believed that geometrical forms express cosmic realities. And we would even say things as startling as that they have personalities. The circle has a meaning, and that meaning is something that doesn't come out of your psyche. It is something that comes out of the nature of the circle itself, which is a point, and the radii, and then the circumference. That has a lot of meaning. It has intrinsic meaning. And the circle is celestial. The golden section, which is one of the greatest beauties in the natural world. And it's right here on the petals of the flowers. It's right in the DNA that you have in your body. It's in your teeth, the proportions of your body, the golden section. But that golden section, it embodies these truths as well. So, virtue and goodness, these things are essential to that. And in our tradition, one of the amazing things, and I use the word tradition, meaning the tradition of Islamic civilization, Islamic culture, as it expressed itself in so many different ways in your lands of the Malay-Indonesian archipelago, and in China under the Muslim Chinese, and in Central Asia and elsewhere. But in our tradition, we have this amazing legacy of not dividing the arts and the sciences, which is one of the fundamental realities of most, if not all, secular establishments today. We didn't do that. We were a civilization in which the sciences and the arts always went together. And our great scientists were also poets. And they were also architects. And they were also people of art who did different types of art. This is very important, very amazing. So we were able to bring out beauty in everything. And the Sharia, which is the pathway to life, the pathway to water, Islamic law, the prophetic way, the Sharia was always connected to beauty. And our fuqaha maybe don't write about that in their books. They write just about certain problems. But they all knew that in experience, that when the Sharia is applied in an organic and sound and wise way, that it does produce beauty also. It creates extremely beautiful cities and civilizations. The Muslim city was incredibly beautiful. And again, it's based on certain basic principles. We have a law of the city. You can't build a city anywhere in Islamic law. The city has got to meet certain requirements. And what is number one requirement that the city has to meet? What is it, Abbas? Yeah. I can't hear you. It's got to be able to feed itself. The city must be able to feed itself. And all of our traditions, cities, Kuala Lumpur is a good example of that. Easy for it to feed itself, traditionally. But Damascus, Granada, Cairo, Istanbul, all these Konya, all of these cities that we built, the first thing, they can feed themselves. And that means that they're able to keep their people alive. So that if trade is cut off by war, or by starvation, or by drought, or whatever it may be, that the city has resources in its own gardens and in the lands around it, so that it can keep its people alive. Even if they're going to live off of wheat and milk, or dates and water, or whatever it may be. But the city must be able to sustain its population. And then by trade, we will bring in all sorts of other things. Different types of food, different types of fruit, different types of good, but we don't depend on them ever. The city will be self-sufficient in that regard. And the second thing, you can make it the first and reverse the order, the city must be able to give its people water. It must be able to take care of its animals, to give them water to drink. It must be able to water its gardens and to water its crops. And if you don't have that access to water, unpolluted water, which may not be polluted, then you can't have a city there. And if we look at many cities in the world today, you would see that they don't fulfill those first two requirements. And we have in the Muslim world a number of cities that are very beautiful and very thoughtful. But if their desalination plants were destroyed in war or broke down, the city could not last, unfortunately, a single day. And if the ships coming into their harbors could not bring in the food that they're bringing from abroad, they could not last a single day. Traditionally in the Muslim world, we would say you can't do that. And I'm not criticizing any of those cities. They're part of the modern secular economic system. But we never wanted to do that. And we create this self-sufficiency. And then we build the cities in ways that are very beautiful. You know, for example, in a traditional Muslim city like those of Spain and Portugal, North Africa, the Mediterranean, usually the houses will be walled. They'll have a wall around them. Often that wall will be white. It might be light blue or some other color, but it'll be a standard color that everyone has access to. Can you decorate your wall? No. The judge won't let you do that. And our judges were the ones who ruled the cities everywhere. And these judges were people who were very qualified. And they were also loved by the people. And they took care of business. You didn't have to wait for a week. He will do it in an hour. If you violate the laws of the city, he will act immediately. He has people that he does that through. But can you decorate your wall? No. You paint it white and you keep it white. Why can't you decorate your wall? Can you decorate the inside of your wall? Yes. Your house can be a palace. You can do in your garden whatever you want. Why can't you decorate your wall? Because then we will know who is rich and who is poor. So we want to have a city in which the rich and the poor can live side by side. And many traditional Muslim cities are like that. And we have our brother here from Algeria. I remember going in Algeria to the houses of friends that were in neighborhoods where in fact a lot of people were poor. And if you go to their door, you would think that there's nothing special about this place. And they open the door, and you go in, and you turn a corner, and then you turn a corner, and you're in paradise. This house was spectacular. The garden was spectacular. But you would never know on the outside who is rich and who is poor, so that the rich and the poor can live next to each other. They can be neighbors of each other, and maybe they can help each other in different ways. So all of this is part of that truth and justice that brings virtue and goodness and produces beauty. And that's what we had. So, we have this balance between things, and we don't compartmentalize. And spirituality, as I've said before, is not going to be a peripheral part of our experience. It will be central to everything we do. And even it should be there in the sciences. We should have scientists who are also artists, who are also poets. And again, if you get the balance right, and you bring in the spiritual component, which we believed was necessary, then that is exactly what will happen. So, another thing that is very important, and maybe I can talk about this for a minute, and hopefully we can then open up the floor to your opinions and to your discussion, is the fact that we cannot think except in terms of the cognitive frames we have in our minds, the paradigms, the cognitive frames. Okay, so the cognitive frames, they determine what we can accept and what we cannot accept. And there's a book here that you might want to read by George Lakoff, Lakoff. It's a little book, you can read it easily, called Don't Think of an Elephant. And it's about cognitive frames and about how they affect us so profoundly. And then it's especially about how in my own country, the United States, over the last 50 years, especially, billions of dollars have been spent by the right wing to create think tanks and other institutions that will shape and narrow the cognitive frames of as many of the American people as they can, so that they can get their people elected according to the agendas they set. And they can create a population, for example, in which an election might be determined by one issue, like immigration, or like abortion. And that will be the whole focus. And there will be no understanding of the complexity of issues. Right now, one of the great challenges to American democracy is the next presidential election, in my opinion. And Donald Trump is certain to be the Republican nominee. He's basically won. If he doesn't win, that will be extremely extraordinary. So he'll probably win. And does the Republican Party welcome him? Most of them don't. George Romney says, I won't even go to the convention. And many other big Republicans, they say, I'm not even going to go there. Okay, but who do you blame? Blame yourself. Because you, over the last 50 years, have set these highly prejudicial, highly reductionist cognitive frames that you use to get your people elected on non-issues so that you could do your agendas. And Trump trumped you because he came out with all the evil and viciousness that those cognitive frames were based on. And then he's able to get people to listen to him and to identify with him. And will they be able to elect him? We hope not. Even though we don't know for sure until it's over. And this is, to me, a huge setback for us. I grew up in Athens, Georgia, as the brother pointed out. And that was in the segregated South. My family was from the Middle West. We moved to Georgia. And alhamdulillah, my family was not a racist family. We weren't like that, but around us was a very racist, segregationist society. No different, really, than South Africa in those days with apartheid. And people could and would say things in public that might make Trump blush. And it was a potentially violent society, especially for blacks. And the blacks were totally segregated. I remember when I was a young, and when the civil rights movement was really picking up steam in the early 60s. And I was walking home from school, of course in a white neighborhood. The blacks don't live where the whites live, unfortunately. And I remember a young black man who was there. He's not supposed to be there. He's, in fact, his life is in danger if he is there. And he was very handsome. And he was tall. And he was probably a good Christian, probably a disciple of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. God have mercy on him. He was a good man. And, you know, he believes in himself. He believes in God. He believes in his people. And he confronted me. And he said, "You're coming from high school, aren't you?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "And what do you study?" And I said, "I study physics. I study this. I study German and other things." And he said, "You realize, or do you not realize, that half of the subjects you're studying are not offered in my school, my high school?" And he said, "Do you think that's fair?" And I said, "No, it's not fair. It's not fair." And then he just left. Also because he's in danger. He's not supposed to be there. He could be killed, actually, in that society. So that was a nightmare that we lived in those days. And I and many others were very happy to see that begin to go, and then hopefully to see it gone in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s. And now we've got this specter up there again, who is saying the things that we were taught you cannot say, who is raising this specter of racism and viciousness. And is that a bad thing? I think it is. Some people tell me maybe it's not that bad. They say maybe it's good, because if it's defeated, then we can tell the American people, look at you. You know, you almost elected this man. You need help. And don't think that you've solved your problems. Don't think this racism is finished. We've got to deal with it seriously. Some people say that we will see that what we thought was gone was actually just hidden. But in any case, cognitive frames, they're very, very important. You've got to get the cognitive frames correct. And one of the problems, you know, that we face in today's world is cognitive frames. For example, we are taught in modern science that we live in a universe which is a closed system, a self-contained closed system of nothing but energy and matter, where everything that happens is by chance or by natural law. There's no design and there's no designer. Okay, if that's your cognitive frame, you will not be able to see the reality that's before you. Tomorrow, when I talk about beauty, the splendor of truth, I want to show a beautiful video that's on YouTube, which you can look at yourself, called Nature by Numbers. It's only 3 minutes long, and it's by a Spanish producer whose name is Cristobal Vila, V-I-L-A. And if you see this, this is so spectacular. It shows how the golden series of numbers, Fibonacci series of numbers, goes through all creation and produces the golden section, which is at the heart of everything God created. It's amazing, absolutely amazing. And it is designed in the most perfect sense that design could ever be. Okay, but the closed system universe, it cannot accept that. And as long as that cognitive frame is there, and it is not replaced by one that has in it design and designer, then that reality cannot be computed. Tomorrow also we want to talk about Islam in America, the roots of Islam in America. And I have two presentations. One of them is Muslims in America before Columbus, ? And the other one is Muslims in our American past, speaking to my people, 1586 to 1965. As we have Muslims, big Muslims in our past, going back to the 16th century, and Sir Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake. This is very important history. But if, for example, and one of the things you'll see, we have very good evidence that the kingdom of Mali in West Africa, which included what is today Mali, Senegal, Mauritania, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea-Conakry, parts of Burkina Faso, this great kingdom of Mali, that they sent in 1312 2,400 boats across the Atlantic. And the emperor of Mali, Mansa Kankan Abu Bakr II, he went with them. Okay, and they got to the other side. We have evidence of that. But in order for you to process that, there's certain things that you have to accept, which you might not know. That how could they cross the ocean from the Gambia, for example, to Barbados, 5,000 miles? And they don't have ships like the ones we have today. So how could they do it? And of course, here, one of the things we'll see is you have the equatorial current, which is one of the strongest in the world. And if you get caught in that current, you will go to America whether you like it or not. You see, so it's like once you get this in your cognitive frame, you can see how these people were coming to America. And in fact, one of the things you'll see if you come to that lecture is that when we look at the oldest Americans, the oldest examples of human beings in America that we know of, which are people that lived 15,000 years ago or 13,000 years ago, and were found in Mexico, southern Mexico, which is equatorial current territory, contact area, and also in southern Brazil, which is also equatorial current contact area. They were Africans. They were not Asians. They were Africans. And the oldest civilization we have in America, which is the Olmec civilization, they were Africans. And a lot of this we've known for years. It's just the cognitive frames don't allow the people to compute it. They don't allow the people to compute it. So for example, in the National Museum of Mexico, there are terracottas, these clay figures of human beings, made of clay that's burned, terracotta. And one of these, they're first of all, many of these are distinctly African, and they are pre-Columbian. And one of them, I wish I could show it to you. Tomorrow I will if you come. And it is a man who is jet black. He's as black as ebony. And he is a West African without any question. And he has an ancient West African helmet on his head. And I asked one friend of mine in the Gambia, what do you think about this man? And he said, Donso, which means a hunter. This is a hunter, because the hunter is a very special type of person in that culture. He's not just good at hunting, but he knows by some kind of spiritual sense where it's safe and where it's dangerous, where the prey is that he wants, whether he should go by water or go by land. These are traditional gifts that they cultivated. So he would be very important in the expedition. He probably was one of the most important people. And he is so African, you could not deny it. And one of the great scholars who studies about this, who's Alexander von Wutenau, he would take German graduate students and show them this terracotta and say, this is from Mexico around 1320. What is it? And they would say, it looks like an African, but it cannot be. There were no Africans in America before Columbus. Okay, and don't say anything bad about Germans. Germans are good people. I'm part German myself. I wouldn't allow for that. But it's cognitive frames. You see, because they have been given a cognitive frame that they believe to be conclusive, which is that there were no Africans in America before Columbus and the unfortunate Atlantic slave trade. Okay, and here you've got proof that that's not true. In fact, one of the things you'll hear tomorrow is, if you come, and you're welcome, I hope we have enough room. Yeah, but I actually shouldn't be making invitations without permission. But one of the things that you'll see, this is a historical fact. I'm telling you, historical fact, that Cortez, who is one of the conquistadores, he's one of the Spanish conquerors of the New World, America. They weren't very nice, by the way. When he conquered Mexico City, which was the Aztec capital, it was called Tenochtitlan. When he conquered Mexico City, he says, he writes in his memoirs, and no one will say I'm wrong, we found in this city muchas mezquitas y casas bonitas y teocallis. He said, we found in this city many mosques and pagan temples and beautiful houses. Cognitive frame kick in, please. And cognitive frame is, there were no mosques in America before Columbus. So therefore, this is not true. I mean, we really shouldn't be like that, but that's the way we are. Really, we should say, hey, wait a minute. My cognitive frame needs to be adjusted. Brilliant people can do that. Malcolm X, I became a Muslim through Malcolm X. He was like that. This man was a genius. He was a courageous man. But Malcolm could always review and redo his cognitive frames. It's one of the ways you can look at him. And that's why wherever he finds the truth, he will accept it and follow it, even if it means death. Because ultimately he knew that by speaking truth to the segregationist establishment of the United States, he would be killed. But he said, I'll pay my dues. I'll speak the truth. In any case, so then historians will say that, well, the Spanish are really strange. When they come to America in the 16th century, they're finding mosques everywhere. But there were no mosques. I mean, wouldn't it be better to trust them? But they don't do that. You see, they can't do it. It's cognitive frames. You've got to show them, first of all, that it is in the realm of possibility. It is, in fact, in the realm of probability that there were Muslims in America before Columbus. And then when the Spanish are finding them there, you can see that, well, that's the way it was. What happened to them, we don't know. But they must have been there. So cognitive frames are very important. And when we talk about spirituality, and I'll try to end now, then we've also got to get the cognitive frames right. And this is one of the things that our scholars will always do. When we teach theology, aqidah, for example, we're going to give you the cognitive frames you need so that you can speak intelligently about God and about the world. And these will be cognitive frames that you studied probably when you were little, about necessary being and possible existence, about the ontological attribute, the negative attributes, the positive attributes, about the nature of change and possibility. Once you've got that down and you understand it, you open up your eyes and you can see. And you can see that the world glorifies the existence of God. Without those cognitive frames, you cannot think. Especially when we have been dummied down. Nature is one of the greatest manifestations of beauty there is. You have beautiful nature here. And so do we, and so do other people. And when you have that beauty in nature, it means there is goodness, and it means there is truth and God. And the first nations of my land, they knew this really well. One of the things that's always startled me, in the United States, I always believed that one of the most beautiful things we had that we share with Canada is the Niagara Falls. They are spectacular, especially in winter, when you have these huge mountains of ice that are created by the vapor coming up from the waterfall. Spectacular, beyond words, in any season. And the Grand Canyon. And there are many other things as well. But one of the things that I always notice painfully when I go there is that most of the tourists cannot respond. I remember going to Niagara Falls and hearing some of my own countrymen, God guide them, He guided me, God guide them, saying, wow, that's a lot of water. And it's like, couldn't we do a little bit better? I mean, we can't really start a poem with those words. And this doesn't show a whole lot of understanding or sensitivity even. And in the Grand Canyon, it's like most of them, in my experience, they don't even say anything. They just take pictures. Click, 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 click. We'll work on this later. I don't know what this is in front of me, but it's certainly worthy of taking pictures. So, and this is what? Cognitive frames. Because when you get the right cognitive frames, then you can look at that and open your eyes and see what it means. So this is also part of the spiritual education, but again, I would say it's part of education in general. That we have to talk about, as Imam al-Ghazali does, what is the heart? And of course, it is the muscular heart. The Prophet said, peace be upon him, that in the body of the human being there is a piece of flesh, which if it is right, إِذَا صَلَحَتْ, the whole body is right. And if it is sick or not right, فَسَدَتْ, the whole body is sick. And what is it? أَلَا وَهُوَ الْقَلْبِ, it's the heart. And here, very clearly, the Prophet ﷺ is speaking about the muscular heart, the one that those of you who studied medicine know so much about. But that muscular heart, which does have in it thousands and thousands of neurons, and does communicate with the brain, and has brain functions, by the way, and works independently of the brain. It is miraculous. But that muscular heart is part of a heart of hearts, which is the spiritual heart, which also is part of the world we live in. Because again, we do not accept the reductionist cognitive frame that reality is just what I can touch, taste, smell, see, or hear. That this is in fact the lowest level of reality. It is beautiful, it is real, it is worthy of study. And we can study it in physics and chemistry and in other types of science. But it is the lowest level of reality. And then there are other realities that inform it. This belongs to the mulk. And it has its representation in the malakut. Jesus Christ apparently used that word in the Syriac Bible when he talks about the kingdom of heaven. He says, malachuta, malachuta, the malakut, the angelic world, the spiritual world. The Bible usually calls it kingdom of heaven. But they're not talking about the garden, they're talking about the malakut, the greater kingdom, and then the jabarut. So reality is complex. That's also a cognitive frame. That reality is not simplex. This reality is not simplistic. It's not just what you can see, touch, taste, hear, and smell. Reality has richness and texture and quality. And it's much more than you can see with your eyes. Okay? So then we have the heart, which is muscular heart. But we have also the spiritual heart, the heart of hearts. That heart which is capable of being truly human. And what makes us truly human. And then also we have the nafs. We have the soul, which is also the psyche. It is also the ego. And we have the intellect, aql. And we have then the ruh, the spirit. And again, we talk about four separate things, but Imam al-Ghazali is going to tell us that these four things are complementary, that they are integral parts of one reality, and therefore they cannot be compartmentalized in any way that makes them independent of each other. And he will even say that ultimately the nafs, the soul, is the heart. And the heart is the soul. And the heart and the soul are the intellect. And the intellect is the spirit. Okay, now this is something that probably most of us right now, if we haven't studied it, are having a difficult time computing. Why? Cognitive frames. We've got to have the cognitive frames that enables us to navigate and to understand that kind of reality and to fathom it. Rich cognitive frames, sound cognitive frames. So this also has to be a part of spiritual education. That teaching ourselves what is the spirit. That is obviously the goal of a spiritual education, is to empower the spirit. And we say that the greatest thing that can happen to a human being is when your spirit speaks to your heart. And God speaks to your spirit. This is what we call ilham. We call this inspiration. This is always in Arabic something positive. That God inspires your spirit, and your spirit speaks to your heart. And then you're able to receive that language which has no words, and to interpret it in beauty, in words, beautiful words, beautiful grace, beautiful manners, good character. So this is very important, getting that language right, getting those cognitive frames right so that we can think, we can be liberated. That's very, very important. And again, in saying this, for us, education has got to be the education of everything. It's not just the spirit. It's not going to be just spiritual education. Physics should be spiritual education. Chemistry should be spiritual education. Physical education should be spiritual education. How can your body be healthy if you're not in your body? And how can you be in your body if your spirit is not there? You are one integral whole. So everything that we believe in fits together in a harmonious synthesis. And this is what your ancestors knew really well, especially in this part of the world. You were and you remain very sophisticated people. This is also reflected in your art. It's reflected in your architecture. To me, architecture is the supreme form of art. Okay? So we bring it all together. The artist can tell you what no one else can. The poet can reveal to you the secrets of the world just in a few words. So everything goes together, and one of the greatest accomplishments of Islamic civilization, something that begins probably with Jabir ibn Hayyan. He's one of the first people. He's there in the 2nd century of the Hijrah. And he begins to do this with chemistry, is what we could call the rooting of knowledge. Meaning that in all forms of knowledge, we look for the underlying realities, the underlying principles, the underlying truth that they all hold in common. And we try as much as possible to use a common language of intellect for everything we learn. There will be terminological differences. There have to be. But nevertheless, the general language will be coherent. So that economics speaks the language of anthropology. Anthropology speaks the language of sociology. Sociology speaks the language of embryology. Embryology was one of the things we did amazing work in well over 1,000 years ago. But again, we studied embryology in a way that was medically accurate, but at the same time that was sophisticated in terms of our theology and our philosophy and so forth. So this is the way that we try to bring all of the sciences together and to make them all spiritual. That's why, again, we produce scientists and ulama who were also poets, who were also artists. And if you look at Fakhruddin al-Razi, the great Shafi'i scholar, what did he not master? If you look at someone like Shihabuddin al-Qarafi, who was like Maliki Shafi'i, he actually uses both schools very well. One of the most brilliant of the fuqaha. And what would he do at night? He probably didn't sleep at night. But he would make water clocks. And he would do other things. He was a master in engineering. Beautiful engineering. Making water clocks. A water clock even that will tell him when it's time for the adhan. And he said, the only thing I regret is I could not get that clock to call the adhan. He said, I worked on that so hard. And he said, I know it can be done, but he wanted to get his clock to actually call the adhan. And he said, that one I didn't figure out. If he'd lived longer, he probably would have. So these are amazing people. And again, this is all spirituality. This is spirituality that belongs to the world, that belongs to everything that we do. As you know, in the beautiful hadith of Jibreel, of Gabriel, when Gabriel comes to the Prophet ﷺ and sits before him and asks him, what is Islam, what is Iman, what is Ihsan? All of you know that hadith. And this is a beautiful hadith, and it is in the very end of the Madanese period. It's probably after Hijjatul Wida. That we don't know for certain, but many ulama, they say it's probably after Hijjatul Wida, the farewell pilgrimage. It's not too long before the Prophet's passing, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it shows the greatness of the Sahaba. They are so great that they are worthy of an audience with Gabriel. Jibreel comes and sits there before them in his beautiful human form. He has a human form and an angelic form, as you know. And then he asks, what is Islam? You know, it is that you bear witness that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God, and you establish the prayer, and you pay the charity tax, and you fast the month of Ramadan, and you make pilgrimage if you can. And what is Iman? That you believe in God, you believe in His angels, you believe in His books, you believe His prophets, you believe in the resurrection of the dead, the last day, and you believe in the predestination of good, of good and evil. That of it which is sweet, that of it which is sour or bitter. Iman, theology. And then, what is ihsan? What is moral perfection? What is entrance into beauty? Because ihsan, as you know, comes from the word for beauty. So this is to be a Muslim beautifully, with grace, with adab. You know, and he says that you worship God as if you could see Him. For although you do not see Him, He sees you. And this is what enables us to make everything spiritual and to have ihsan in all of the things that we do. I think it's good to stop here, and I would love to have a discourse, a dialogue with you. You express your opinions and any questions. Who will moderate? Will you moderate the questions? Thank you. What is your name? Ridwan? Thank you very much. So thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khairan kaseeran for the very inspiring discussion, Sheikh. So I will call upon few questions because we have time limitations. From the sister sides, I will allow only 3 questions, and from the brother sides as well, 3 questions only. So we're going to start with sister sides, and then we move on to brother sides. All right? Okay. Tafaddal. If you don't have any questions, I'll have questions, Sheikh. Sheikh? Is it okay for me to ask questions?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, we have here a question. Right here.
All right. Okay.
You can't refuse her.
All right.
Okay.
Okay, tafaddal.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Brother Umar. separation of intellect from virtues, and also this has been aggravated by the period of colonization and secularization. And I remembered when I was listening to you at Akim, you mentioned that we have to restore intellect, but we couldn't pursue that further because I'd like to know how do we restore that intellect, the Islamic intellect, not the way the West has conceived of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. When we talk about intellect in Islam, we are talking about that faculty of the human being that embraces all cognition, that embraces logic and reason and empirical rationalism and everything else. And Imam al-Ghazali and many others, they write extensively about intellect. And their writings about it are very rich and very profound. But especially when we use the word intellect in our theological discourse and other related types of discourse in Islam, we are talking about that capacity that the human being has to know certain fundamental truths without any need of experience. That's very important. It's very important. So, intellect then, as it pertains to that capacity that we have to know the truth and to understand the truth, it is independent of experience. This water quenches my thirst. How do I know that? By experience. This is also reason. This is also intellect. That every time I have taken water when I haven't been sick, it quenches my thirst. So on that basis, I am able to make a sound statement, rational statement, that water quenches thirst. It's connected to that. But first principles don't need experience. For example, if you look at basic geometric and mathematical truths or axioms, they don't need experiment. The triangle has 3 angles, of course, and the sum of those angles is going to be 180 degrees, no matter what kind of triangle you're talking about. No matter how strangely constructed that triangle is. Always, the sum of the angles will be 180 degrees. And when you studied that in geometry, did you have to go to the laboratory? Did you have to go to other countries to see if it's true in Germany too? And if it's true of Chinese triangles? No. Of course, you will do your drawings. You'll use your protractor, and you will measure the angles and so forth. But essentially, your intuition, based on intellect, enables you to go from these drawings immediately to confirm the truth that the sum of the angles of a triangle is 180 degrees. It is independent, therefore, of experience. Even though here it's close because it's geometry, it's drawing, it's two-dimensional. And in mathematics, we know that there are even numbers and odd numbers, rational numbers and irrational numbers. We know also that the sum of 1 plus 1 is 2. It can't be more, it can't be less. And this is independent of experience. And we don't have to gather oranges and apples and nuts and different things and say, yes, it works with apples, it works with oranges, it works with nuts. Okay, that's the way intellect works. And in the West, in the last 500 years, especially in the wake of Kant, the German philosopher, that intellect was affirmed. The use of intellect mathematically and geometrically and so forth in the service of the empirical sciences. But the metaphysical intellect that flies, that was, well, its wings were clipped. Kant did that. Other people do it too, but especially Kant does that. And he does it really even maliciously. There is a great Muslim scholar today, Karim Lahan, who lives at Oxford, and he has a book called Muhammad Shahrur's Cargo Cult. You can find it on the internet if you want. And in it, he's got incredible quotations from Kant that show how malicious some of the things Kant did actually were. That he knows what he's doing. But intellect, then, this eagle that soars, it is the one that knows that the part cannot be greater than the whole. Okay, you don't have any problem with that, do you? And it knows that the greater cannot proceed of itself from the lesser. That one maybe we have to talk about, because a lot of so-called science today is based on the contradiction of that fundamental truth. You know, Darwinian evolution as conceived by the materialists was that these great forms come out of essentially nothing. And he believed that what he would call the lower forms of life, like the amoeba, are essentially nothing more than jelly. And then out of that, boom, you get these other species. So you've got the least producing the greatest. And in terms of intellect, that is impossible. And that's why intellect will say, wait, you're wrong here. There's something else going on. This is not an explanation. Of course, one of the things that we've discovered with the discovery of DNA is that amoeba that looks so simple has in it the same program of DNA that you've got and that the elephants got. And viruses have it too. So therefore, there's nothing simple about that amoeba in the first place. It is highly complex. And it is highly designed. And you can't have design without a designer. But the greater cannot proceed from the lesser of itself. This is very important. This is very important. Now that's something today that we're going to have to talk about. That, like, why? In the past, usually you wouldn't have to do that. It's enough just to say it. I've got it. But because today we have been taught cognitive frames that fundamentally contradict that, especially in biology, then we've got to say that, okay, why do we say that? So we have to train people here. Change indicates beginning in time. This is a fundamental theological truth. The Quran refers to this over and over again. It is the proof of Abraham against his people. His people in the Quran, as you know, they worshipped a trinity. And historically today, we call that the Semitic Trinity. And that Semitic Trinity that the Canaanite, that the Chaldeans brought into Iraq was Venus, the moon, and the sun. It was Ashtaroth, and it was Sheen, that's what they called the moon, and it was Shemesh, the sun. And as you know in the story of Abraham, his people call him to worship one of those. And first he looks at Venus, the Kaukab, and he says, no, it changes. Can't be my Lord. And he looks at the moon, and it sets like Venus, changes. Therefore, it can't be my Lord. And the sun, it sets, changes. Can't be my Lord. Okay, this is what we call genius. Abraham's not a prophet at that time. He hasn't been ordained, he hasn't been sent as a prophet or a messenger. He's just a perfect human being with brilliant intellect. And he knows that because these objects belong to space and time and they change, they can't be divine. They cannot account for creation. Okay, that is a big rule of intellect. And therefore, when we look at a world full of change, which is the physicist's definition of the world, is just locuses of change, then we know it's got to have a beginning. And then we know also by intellect, conclusively, that which gives it its beginning cannot be like it. It cannot also have a beginning. It cannot also be dependent. It must be totally self-sufficient. It must be what we would call, in the language of the intellect, necessary being. Okay, that's really powerful language. That's really powerful. That's a cognitive frame, that's really amazing. And so this is intellect. And how do we train that? I think that this has got to be part of our curriculum. We need exercises. We need to walk people through this. We need to understand, for example, that intellect works by the fundamental rules of what is necessary in and of itself, what is impossible in and of itself, and what is possible. And that they're just those three categories. So we need to be trained in that. And for you to be trained in that and then to become astute in it is just natural. Not difficult. It's not difficult. But if you've never used the intellect, then it atrophies. It atrophies, and we have to bring it back to life. Now, I think this is very, very important. We have to have workbooks that work us through this, inshallah. May we do that. And then it's really beautiful. First principles are really amazing. And they are what enable you to understand experience. Without them, you cannot understand experience. And they must be the foundations of every science.
Okay, thank you, Sheikh. Now, questions from brother side.
Walaikum salam.
My question is, first of all, I think a few takeaway points from your deliberations now. The fact that everything is spiritual, every experience of man is spiritual and has that spiritual dimension to it. And it is the onus is on us to actually make everything spiritual. And for that, the organ of the heart was the thing that you mentioned, and thus you come to the conclusion of the hadith on ihsan. My question is, a little I know from scholars of tasawwuf. Tasawwuf is the science of ihsan, and the practice of ihsan is tariqah. Now the question is one that looks at the Malaysian context. And in the tabloids, there is a certain trend that try to demonize certain tariqah, which I believe there's some proper justification for that, because they might be doing something wrong. Fine, but my question is there any role for tariqah in particular with the aim of trying to improve the spiritual education of society? And if there is any role, then the next question is, how do you find out whether this tariqah, this line of tasawwuf circles, or halaqah or zikr circles are the right ones? So thank you.
Thank you. I didn't understand the question exactly. I had a little bit, so I didn't understand exactly what you were asking. I'm sorry.
What is the role of tariqah in spiritual education?
Of tariqah?
Yes.
Okay.
And if there is that role, how do you find out whether this tariqah is the right one or not?
Okay. So the word tariqah, which means a path, and the person who follows it is called imbara. I just had to say that. I love this word imbara, and I love the logo too. It's really, I think, well done. I think I really respect our brothers and sisters tremendously, and we hope that imbara becomes really something that brings great good to this region. But tariqah is the path. It's a special word for path. And originally in Islam, we talk about sharia, which is the outward law, the prophetic law. And it's usually formal, that you've got to stand like this when you pray, you've got to bow like this, stand back up, do you have to straighten your back or not? Then you prostrate this way, you do it in this manner. It's usually about formalities. If you get married, you've got to have the dowry, this is its definition. You've got to have the guardian's consent, this is his definition. You've got to have the agreement, you've got to have the witnesses, and so forth. So that's sharia, it's the outward law. And it is always in our tradition concerned with outwardness. Because in the sharia, we do not judge people. We do not like to presume what their intention is or what is in their heart. And those of you who've studied Islamic law, you could talk about that to a great extent, to great length. And then we have what is called haqiqah. And this word occurs in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ and elsewhere. And the haqiqah has many meanings, but here it means those truths that are principial, those truths that are fundamental to the structure of reality, such as the fact that the spiritual dominates the physical, not the other way around. There is a spiritual world, there is malakut, and that world is more real than this world that we can see. The world of the dead, the third life. We have how many lives? 5. Right? You have the life before this one, which was a spiritual life that was extremely long. And most of us met each other there first. And then you have this life, life number 2, the life of this world. Begins in the womb, and it ends with the grave, or with death. Not everybody goes to a grave. Some people die at sea, or they're burned in fires, or other things happen. But it ends with death. And then you have the third life, and the third life is what we call the barzakh, the interspace, the intermediate world, the world of the dead. And everyone is alive in that world. No human spirit ever dies. We are alive, no matter whether we believed or not, we will be alive in our graves. Okay? That's a malakuti world. You don't see it, it's right here actually. It's under the ground, it's right here, it's even in the sky. But you don't see it. Most people don't see it. There are people that do see it, but they have a special spiritual state to do that. And they don't usually like to have that spiritual state, because it's not pleasant as a rule. Okay? And then you have the fourth life, and that is what? Resurrection. And then the gathering on the earth. The earth will be one continent. All the waters of the earth will be one sea. And there will be no hills or mountains or anything. It will be one plain, huge plain. And all the generations of the human beings and of the jinn, the spirits, will be there, resurrected. You can see them then. And then the angels come by the millions, and they fill that. That's the fourth life. And it ends with judgment. And then you have the fifth life, which is what? The garden and the fire. May we be people of the garden, and may we never go to the fire. So that's a haqiqah. Those are haqiqahs. And the spiritual dominates the physical. You cannot understand this at all if you don't relate it to what is beyond it. That's haqiqah. And then you have tariqah, which is the methodology or the path that takes you from sharia to haqiqah without violating the sharia. And the early Muslims would say that, and this is attributed to Imam Malik. Some scholars would say that he didn't say it. One great scholar who's a friend of mine, who is one of the best scholars of hadith in the world today, who is Sheikh Khaldun al-Ahdab, who's from Syria. And I asked him, did Malik actually say this? And he said, we don't know. But he said it was said in his time. It goes back to his time. And that is, man sharra'a wa lam yatahaqqaq tafassaq. Whoever lives by the outward law alone, the sharia alone, وَلَمْ يَتَحَقَّقْ, and knows nothing of the haqa'iq, does not taste the haqiqah, does not taste the sweetness of faith, they become corrupt. They become deviant. You cannot live by bread alone. This is what Jesus is said to have said. And he means by that, you can't live by the outward law alone. And then they would say, وَمَنْ تَحَقَّقَ وَلَمْ يَتَشَرَّعْ تَزَنْدَقْ. That whoever lives by the haqa'iq, and they are beautiful, and they are rich beyond words, and they're endless. It's a sea that never ends. But whoever lives by the haqiqah, and you might know people that do that. I do. I could name half a dozen people right off. Don't want to do that. But they just live in the world of haqiqah. And they don't have sharia. They don't follow the prophetic law. So those people are zindiq. They're heretics. That's worse than fasiq. وَمَنْ تَشَرَّعَ وَتَحَقَّقْ فَقَدْ تَحَقَّقْ, or فَقَدْ تَصَوَّفْ. That whoever lives by the sharia carefully, wisely, sincerely, and also imbibes the haqiqah, they've got it. They've got the haqiqah. And also in one transmission they have tasawwuf. This is the Sufi. The word Sufi is a word that develops in the end of the 1st century. And it's a neologism. It's a made-up word. But so are so many other words. Aqidah is one too. There's no problem with making new words. But it's a word that appears at the end of the 1st century. And then it becomes well known in the 2nd century. In fact, Jabir ibn Hayyan was called what? A Sufi. He's one of the first people that was called by that, this great chemist. Okay? But they would say that Sufism was a reality that had no name. And then it became a name that had no reality. And they're very funny, by the way. The Sufis have a good sense of humor. That's what they say. And they say it was a reality that had no name. In other words, this is the way the Prophet was. He was beautiful. He was a man of the heart. These were spiritual people of the highest spirituality imaginable. But that was deen. They didn't have a name for it. Then it became a name that didn't have a reality. And this is what we have to be really careful about. That if you want a spiritual path, then you've got to make sure that it's authentic. And you've got to make sure that it has a silsila, that it has a real chain going back to the Prophet ﷺ, and that that chain is not cut. Because if it's cut, you will go nowhere. And the Sufis themselves, they warn you that no one will destroy you and hurt you more than a Sufi charlatan. They're the worst. And I know that from a lot of experience. You'll find so-called Sufis who do unspeakable things and destroy people, whole villages. Yeah, that's not good. That's not acceptable. And they will say the second most harmful person is the jurist, faqih, who's a hypocrite. We have those too. Not all jurists are that way. If you look in the Muslim world today, do you know Sheikh Al-Hasan Al-Shafi'i in Egypt? That's a scholar. That's a good man. Nobody really likes him because he doesn't take sides. But he is, to me, faqih. Faqih. I know him personally. I love him. And he doesn't have a whole lot of people who do love him because he speaks the truth. Speak the truth and see how many friends you have. You know. And then the third most harmful person is the hafiz, who's a hypocrite. And you've got some of those too. I remember this wonderful woman that we have in America, who's also wealthy. And she brought two hafiz from some country, I won't say what. And they ran up her phone bill. You know, she had them in her house. They used her phone to call Outer Mongolia. I mean, they had a phone bill that was one of the biggest you could imagine, and they wanted to have pizza and Burger King every night of Ramadan. And, you know, they basically, it's like, I want it, get it for me. And they weren't nice. So, Hafiz, you're not supposed to be like this. And then they say number 4 is the tyrant, the political tyrant. So authenticity is absolutely critical. I hope that's sufficient. I hope that's sufficient.